So over the weekend, XRP has been trading sideways and waiting for a breakout. On the lower time frames, we are squeezing into an apex, waiting for... Over the weekend, XRP's price action was rather stagnant, and that's typically what we see. Sideways momentum leading to a new week where we expect volatility. Now on the lower time frames, XRP is squeezing inside an apex in a symmetrical triangle. Now the decision of this break is likely to guide the direction short term. If we break above and claim resistance and hold it as support, then $1.50 is ultimately the level of resistance to break to push higher. Failing that, if XRP does dip below its support line, there are some Fibonacci targets that I'm looking at to mark a potential higher low. Now, it's worth noting, since the decline where we dropped down to $1.16, XRP witnessed a 30% plus rally back up to $1.50. Now, this was an area of resistance we was watching very closely, and I did expect some sort of pullback or higher low formation. And on the fibs here, these are the targets that I've marked. So if XRP loses this red line of support on the lower time frames, simply look for a minimum $1.33 and at maximum, in my honest opinion, $1.20. Now $1.30 on the 0382, sorry, the 50% fib, not the 0382, sits on this previous high where we corrected back down for a few hours and then broke out to $1.50. So we could turn this previous high from the 6th of January into support of $1.33, but failing that, we have the lows down here, roughly at 130 to 128 at 61% correction, and then 78% of the correction from the local high back down to the lower low sits at $1.20. So simply put, if we do lose support, I'm looking for $1.30 to $1.20 to potentially mark a higher low. Now, what's important to note is on the macro timeframes, I shared this fractal, I think this was back in late January, and XRP was priced at $1.90. And I said that we had this 8-year descending level of resistance, and that XRP is likely to at least backtest this in a spring, potentially before looking into a major run heading into later 2026, right? So this is just a reactive fractal. Again, it's all based on holding this descending resistance trend line and then, of course, clearing the all-time high. So it's not a prediction. It's just simply stating we are backtesting a previous 8-year descending resistance, looking to turn it into support. Now, coming to the most recent update on this fractal, and I shared this, I think it was yesterday or the day before. So we was at $1.90 and we was looking for this back test, and we've now completed that. In fact, we had a wick below back into the triangle, the 8-year triangle that we've been forming, but the candle closes are still retaining above the descending resistance trend line. So as long as XRP closes out February above $1.43, which is right on this trend line, then we could class this as a potential valid scenario, looking for the continuation, looking deeper into 2026. Now, there are a few other fractals that are lining up quite nicely with this. And one of them is this right-angled descending broadening wedge, where you have a descending level of support, which XRP has had ever since it created this pattern in December of 2024. We had an A, a B, a C, and a D. I don't know why I've got these labels mixed up here. I think it's because I did some adjustments earlier, but we had an A, B, C, D, and now we're looking for this explosive E wave, which would take a breakout of the all-time high and push to a target of $10. Now, how you get the target of this wedge is you draw in from one of the most recent points of resistance back down to support, and this is how you get your breakout target. So if XRP does eventually come up and take out its all-time high somewhere in 2026, then we're looking for a move at least towards $10. Now, of course, this is a most impulsive case, the most bullish case scenario. Again, it's not a prediction, but I just wanted to show that this is a pattern that is unfolding and has the potential to shift into bullish momentum. And something else that lines up very closely with it is this bullish megaphone. So the structure is pretty much eerily similar. With the megaphone, we would just draw a trend line on the wicks, sort of ascending highs, right? So we've got these higher highs and lower lows. So if I removed this blue resistance, wedge resistance, you could see that this formation is in structure of a bullish megaphone, which is exactly what we have on the chart here. Similar structure, 1, 2, 3, 4, mark the low, build some double bottom, and then look for the expansion deeper into 2026, right? This is the most bullish case scenario. And again, it ties in with a similar fractal on this right angle descending broadening wedge. So there's two very similar structures here and patterns that could play out for explosive expansion in 2026, albeit considered this $1.16 low holds. Now, I'm not going to cover it in this video, but in my last update a few days ago, I did share multiple fractals if XRP was to lose this local low. And one of the targets I was looking at was back down towards 70 cents. So it's very important to keep that in mind. If XRP does lose this swing low in this wick, we come in over the next couple of weeks and fill it in and start sweeping below, then the next point of contact I'll be looking for at a minimum is roughly sort of 70 cents, which sits back down on these previous highs from July of 2023. Now, it's important to note, right, that since XRP actually broke out of this resistance, so let's have a look at this quickly, right? I'm not going to tap into it too much, but we had this resistance for a couple of years. XRP ended up breaking this resistance, and since such, it hasn't actually back tested this area for support. So if we do lose $1.16, then I would just simply look after breaking out of this resistance for a point of contact back down on this trend line, right? Because as I said, we had it as multi-year resistance for a couple of years, not multi-year, but a couple of years. We was underneath it, we broke above it, and we haven't actually come back down to retest it for support for continuation of the trend. So if it does get any more ugly, just short and sweet, I'm looking for roughly 70 cents, right? But until then, until we actually lose this wedge support or lose the support of the bullish megaphone, this price action is still just a theory, right? Because we're defending the bullish structure. So if we lose $1.16, we look for 70 cents. But if we don't and we hold the $1.16 low, then this is where this right angle descending broadening wedge and bullish megaphone is likely a potential scenario that could unfold deeper into 2026, right? Now, what I wanted to focus on most in this video, other than just looking at certain fractals that are predicting higher targets and obviously dropping down to 70 cents if we lose $1.16, I just wanted to point out, right, the most important thing here for XRP is reclaiming $1.80. This was our 400-day support base, right? And again, I just want to reiterate, the reason why XRP has crashed quite harsh is because this was, again, support for 400 days. We lost that support. We saw a weekly close in January. I think it was the 26th of January. And since then, we've seen like a 40 to 50% decline. Now, the bulls are stepping in. We do have this large wick from last week, okay? And price actually closed at $1.43. Now, if the bulls do want to reclaim control, again, as I said, $1.80 is the main level of resistance to break. Until we see XRP get back above $1.80, then we're still under macro resistance and potentially in murky waters, right? So the main levels, as I said, that I'm looking for where demand could step in here is one, back down on the wick. Okay, this was the wick on this chart from October of 2025. If XRP just comes back down towards $1.39, it could potentially hold a support on this wick and mark a low. But failing that, I'm looking between $1.30 to $1.20. These are the main fib levels. Again, reiterating back to the start of the video on the lower time frames, very similar sort of structure and support levels between $1.30 to $1.20. And it's now the same, again, looking at our demand here on the weekly, right? So I've basically got a fib on from the local high of last week back down to the local low. And these are the fib support targets between $1.30 to $1.20. And that is where I would expect demand to step in. Again, failing that, if not, if demand doesn't step in at $1.30 and XRP continues its trajectory lower, then remember, I'm simply looking for 70 cents to mark a local low, right? So at the moment, we're simply waiting for confirmation. The lower time frames are saying that we're in an apex. A decision is going to come shortly, whether we break above 150 or come back to 120. I've given those support targets. There are bullish fractals that we are analyzing, but to validate them, we have to defend the $1.16 local low. And then again, as I said, $1.80 is the main level of resistance to really open the skies for XRP to push back to its all-time highs. But failing that, we do have demand areas below sitting between 130 to 120. So, it's rather evident even on the heat map. We have this cluster of buy-side liquidity waiting at $1.80, right? Where people are waiting to short. So this is an area that potentially XRP could see a rally because we don't have too much liquidity in this vicinity between 150 to 120, right? Again, weekend chop, it's been a bit sideways, a bit boring, but I would expect volatility to return this week. And again, if XRP on the lower time frames does break out towards $1.50, then that's where we could start seeing the push to 180, right? Where this liquidity is waiting. But failing that, if we don't and we roll over to our support targets, 130 to 120, then this is obviously where liquidity could sweep back down below towards this slim liquidity pocket here at $1.27. So all eyes on XRP at the moment. It's very hard to say, okay, well, the correction's in. I think the most simple way to actually analyze it is a post I shared here on X, right? I said it's pretty simple for XRP. We're hovering around 140, 130, and the key resistance to break is $1.80 to $2.10, which opens the skies and probability of pushing towards all-time highs. Alternatively, the key support to hold is the 120 target we've been looking at for a higher low, or 110, which is the higher low or current lows in this formation that we currently have. And I stated if we lose the current low at $1.10 to $1.16, I think it is. I think it's like $1.12 it was, depending on the exchange. Then we're looking for 70 cents, right? Break resistance, we're looking to run back to $3. So break 180, open skies become available to push to $3. Lose 120 to 110, which is the current low, we're looking for 70 cents. That's it. Don't overcomplicate it. This isn't an area to predict. It's an area to wait for reactions, right? So as long as we're below $1.80, this is still rocky waters for XRP. However, there is support and demand waiting below from this $1.12 wick low that we had last week. And if we do come in and fill in, let's say 50, 60% of that wick, it could offer an opportunity to look for the pushback to 180. Again, but it all hangs in the balance. Let me know in the comments what you think is going to happen next for XRP, and I hope you enjoyed today's content.